Mr. Whitmore, you left your file behind, Annie Carter shouted as she ran past the line of cars outside Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The plastic badge clipped to her navy blouse struck her chest with every step. Guest support intern. A taxi horn screamed as Annie rushed into the crosswalk just before the signal changed. Miss, watch out. Sorry, she called, raising one hand toward the driver without slowing down. She pressed the dark blue file against her chest. Please don't fall now, Annie gasped. Excuse me, please let me through. A family with 3 rolling suitcases blocked most of the sidewalk ahead. Annie searched for an opening as they moved toward a hotel shuttle. Where are you running to? The man asked when she squeezed through the narrow space between them and the vehicle. I have to return this before it's too late. Be careful, the woman called after her. By the time Annie reached the 2nd Street, the back of her right shoe had begun cutting into her heel. She faltered for half a second, feeling the sharp sting beneath her sock, then forced herself forward. Her mother had warned her that the shoes were too stiff for a full shift, but they had been on clearance and looked professional enough for the airport. Annie had told herself they would soften after a few days. They had not. At the 3rd Street, she was almost dragging her right foot. Just a little farther, she told herself. Don't give up. Ahead, a black SUV turned beneath a sign marked private parking. Wait, Annie shouted. Please stop the car. The vehicle continued through the entrance. A metal barrier lowered behind it. No. Annie rushed to the gate and stopped, bending forward with both hands braced against her knees. Sweat gathered along her hairline, and the injured skin behind her heel throbbed with every pulse. A security guard stepped out of a glass booth. Employees use the other entrance, he said. I'm not parking. I need to return this to Mr. Whitmore. The guard looked at the file. You can leave it with me. I need to place it directly into his hands. That isn't necessary. It is to me. The guard studied her airport badge, then her face. What exactly are you trying to do that makes you so determined to see him? The guard demanded. He held out his hand. Give me that file. Now. Annie tightened her grip. Mr. Whitmore left it in the VIP lounge. I'm returning it. That's all. The guard lifted a hand toward his earpiece, but before he could speak, the private elevator doors opened inside the garage. Charles Whitmore stepped out with a man carrying a leather briefcase. Charles was taller than Annie had expected. Annie raised the file. Mr. Whitmore. He stopped. The man beside him moved first, placing himself slightly between them. Charles looked at Annie, then at the file in her hands. Where did you get that? I saw you leave the assistant's desk, so I knew you had forgotten it. Annie bent forward, gripping the folder tightly with both hands, her chest heaving from exhaustion. You left this behind. The documents inside. They're very important. Charles walked closer and took the file from her. He did not thank her. He opened it and checked the front pocket, then the side compartment where a flash drive had been secured beneath an elastic strap. Annie stood still, trying to slow her breathing. Charles looked up. Did you open it? I only opened it to find the owner's name, Annie said, lifting her head and meeting his gaze directly. How much did you read? Enough to see my address. The parking garage seemed to grow quieter. Charles looked at her badge again. Your address? Carter Heights, Building C, Apartment 214. His expression changed, not with sympathy, but caution. Did you photograph any pages or send anything to anyone? No. He turned to the man beside him. Check her phone. The man stepped forward. Annie moved back and put one hand over the pocket of her slacks. No. Charles appeared surprised. This file contains confidential business documents, and it belongs to you. That's why I brought it back. If you didn't copy anything, this will take less than a minute. Annie was still exhausted from running. Returning your property doesn't mean I have to give up my dignity. The man beside Charles glanced toward him, waiting for instruction. Charles held Annie's gaze. Young lady, this is not personal. It became personal when I saw my mother's name on a relocation list. You read more than the cover. The first page was open when I looked for your name, and now you know your building is part of a private acquisition. My mother got a letter last week. It didn't say your company was planning to tear down all 6 buildings. Charles closed the file. That project has been reviewed by engineers, attorneys, and city planners. Has anyone reviewed where the people are supposed to go? That is addressed in the relocation plan. I saw the amount. Charles's face hardened. So this is about compensation. Annie stared at him. He continued, if your family has unusual circumstances, there may be a process for review. I can have someone contact you. You think I ran after your car to ask for money? I think you saw confidential information connected to your home and followed me into a private parking facility. I followed you because the file wasn't mine. Charles said nothing. Annie pointed to it. I could have left it at the airport. I could have given it to security. I could have taken pictures. I didn't. You expect me to accept that without verification? I don't need you to believe me, but you have absolutely no right to do that. Annie shouted as Marcus moved toward her and reached for the pocket of her jacket. She slapped his hand away before he could touch her. Returning something that was lost doesn't mean I have to throw away my self-respect. You can suspect whatever you want, but don't put your hands on me. Charles studied Annie as though she were a problem that had not appeared in the morning briefing. What do you want? He asked. A better payment for your family? Tuition? A job? Annie felt the insult so much. He had placed a price on her before he had managed to say thank you. She stepped toward him and tapped one finger against the file. I didn't run 3 streets to beg you. Her voice was quieter now. I ran because that file didn't belong to me. She turned toward the gate. Each step made the torn skin on her heel sting, but she refused to limp until she reached the sidewalk. Then she stopped. Mr. Whitmore. Charles was still watching her. Before you sign anything, come to Carter Heights. I have complete reports on the property. Your report knows how many square feet are in our apartment. It doesn't know my mother worked 3 jobs to keep it. That does not change the condition of the buildings. No. But it should change the way you decide what happens to the people inside them. Charles's jaw tightened. You don't understand what it takes to rebuild a neighborhood. Annie looked back at him. And you don't understand a neighborhood you've never visited. She walked away before he could answer. On the sidewalk beyond the gate, Annie crossed the same 3 streets at a slower pace, carrying nothing now except the consequences of doing the right thing. Charles had recovered what belonged to him, but Annie had left him with a question no employee could file, summarize, or answer on his behalf. Charles stood in silence beside the private parking lot, watching Annie disappear around the corner. Then he turned and climbed into the waiting SUV. Marcus Lane hurried into the front passenger seat, his irritation still visible as he fastened his seatbelt. We shouldn't have let that girl walk away so easily, Marcus said, twisting around to face Charles. She was disrespectful, sir. I'll have someone check her background and review the airport's internship roster. An intern lecturing the chairman of this company is unacceptable. He adjusted his collar and glanced at the dark blue file in Charles's hands. And who knows how many pages she photographed. Charles did not answer. He opened the file and looked down. The first page that caught his attention was not a profit projection or an architectural rendering. It was an attachment listing the residents of Building C at Carter Heights. Household, Denise Carter and Annie Carter. Length of residency, 17 years. Charles frowned and turned the page. The next document summarized the condition of the building, listing water damage, aging pipes, cracked stairways, and electrical systems that required modernization. He rested the file on his lap and ran his thumb along the edge of its dark blue cover. She wasn't disrespectful, Marcus, Charles said at last. His voice was low and cold enough to silence the other man. She said something you didn't want to hear. But sir, those documents concern our investment strategy for the next quarter. If she takes any of this outside the company, she didn't photograph anything, and she didn't send anything to anyone. Charles looked directly at him. Do you really believe a girl who ran 3 city blocks to return confidential documents would then do something that small-minded? Don't force your own way of thinking onto everyone else. Marcus opened his mouth, but Charles continued before he could answer. When did your team become this careless? Marcus stiffened. A file this important was left behind at an airport. What would have happened if it had been picked up by a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution instead of an 18-year-old intern? Marcus swallowed. There were several partners greeting us in the VIP lounge, sir. We were moving quickly. I'll contact airport security immediately and have them review every camera angle. Enough. Charles tossed the file onto the seat beside him. Take us back to headquarters. Call an emergency meeting on the Carter Heights project. Marcus nodded and faced forward. He did not speak again. The SUV rolled out of the private parking area and merged into Atlanta traffic. The file lay beside Charles, heavier now than it had been that morning. not because of the contracts or projections inside, but because of the last words Annie had thrown back at him before walking away. And you don't understand a neighborhood you've never visited. The executive floor of Whitmore Urban Development remained brightly lit when they reached the company's headquarters. Most employees had gone home, leaving the corridors quiet except for the low hum of the ventilation system. Charles entered his office, dropped the blue file onto his desk, and lowered himself into his chair. He pressed 2 fingers against his forehead. The image that returned was not Annie's angry expression. It was when Marcus reached for her phone. She had stood straight and told them not to touch her. Charles picked up the desk phone and pressed a short extension. "Counselor Price, are you still in the building?" "Yes, Mr. Whitmore," Eleanor Price answered. Her voice was calm and professional. "I'm reviewing the South Atlanta land acquisition agreement. Bring me every original document connected to Carter Heights. I want the initial structural survey, every engineering assessment, all financial alternatives, and any appendix created during the last 3 months." There was a short pause. "Tonight? Now. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Eleanor arrived carrying a thick stack of binders and folders. She had worked long enough with Charles to know when a question was actually an order and when an order concealed a deeper concern. She placed the documents on his desk. "These are the original assessments," she said. "I checked them before coming in." Charles opened the first binder. Eleanor remained standing. "As I noted in my preliminary legal review, the basic structures of the 6 Carter Heights buildings are still sound. 4 of them can be renovated and reinforced. The estimated cost is less than half of full demolition and reconstruction." Charles looked up. Then, "Why does the official proposal describe all 6 buildings as beyond repair?" Eleanor hesitated. "Because the rehabilitation assessment was removed from the final packet submitted to the board last week." Charles turned another page. The findings were clear. Load-bearing walls remained stable. Foundations required localized repair, not complete replacement. Plumbing and electrical systems needed substantial work, but the buildings were not unsalvageable. "Who removed it?" Eleanor drew a slow breath. Marcus Lane authorized the final packet. Charles's expression did not change. His position was that preserving the existing buildings and retaining the current residents would delay commercialization. It would also reduce the projected profit margin expected by several major shareholders. Charles gave a short laugh without humor. Profit margin. He pushed the official proposal beside the engineering report. The difference between them was not a technical misunderstanding. Someone had taken a viable option and made it disappear. "Have you ever been to Carter Heights?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head. "No, sir." The development team described it as a deteriorated complex with no practical value to preserve. Charles rose and walked toward the wall of glass behind his desk. An intern wearing shoes that had cut through her heel ran 3 blocks to return something that did not belong to her, he said. Then she stood in front of me and said I had never set foot in the place she calls home. Eleanor remained silent. And she was right. If you admire Annie for running 3 blocks despite the pain just to return something that did not belong to her, please give this video a like. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because someone near you may be listening to this story at the very same moment. Charles looked down at the streets below. We sit in climate-controlled rooms and sign reports shaped by people who already know what answer we prefer. Then hundreds of families are told to leave, and we call it progress because the paperwork is legal. Eleanor studied him carefully. She understood that this was no longer a routine document review. A project worth hundreds of millions of dollars had reached a point where one decision could alter the company's standing, its investors, and the future of every resident at Carter Heights. "What do you intend to do?" she asked. "The city council is scheduled to hold its final approval hearing tomorrow morning." Charles turned from the window. "Cancel tomorrow's hearing." Eleanor blinked. "The council may not agree to postpone it on such short notice. Then notify them that the submitted packet was incomplete and that Whitmore Urban Development is withdrawing its request for final approval until the record has been reviewed. That will trigger questions from the board." "It should." Charles took his jacket from the back of the chair. "Have a car brought around." Eleanor looked at the time on her phone. "It's late. Where are you going?" Charles picked up the dark blue file. "To Carter Heights." He moved toward the door without hesitation. "I want to see the place that girl defended with nothing but her dignity." The SUV left downtown Atlanta and headed south, moving from glass towers and office lights into neighborhoods where the streets narrowed and the storefronts closed earlier. Charles sat in the back seat with the blue file open beside him, but he did not read. He watched the city change through the window. At Carter Heights, evening had settled over 6 brick buildings arranged around a cracked courtyard. Several exterior lights had burned out. Laundry hung from a second-floor railing despite the cold. A shopping cart stood beside the mailboxes, filled with canned food and a handwritten sign that read, "Take what you need." Near Building B, 2 boys played basketball with a bent rim, while an older man held a flashlight over the open hood of a neighbor's car. Charles's driver slowed. "This is the address, sir." Charles looked at the faded sign near the entrance. Carter Heights. 2 letters had fallen from the name, leaving pale marks in the brick. He stepped out with the file under his arm. The driver started to follow, but Charles raised a hand. "Stay with the car." The SUV drew attention before Charles had taken 10 steps. A woman carrying grocery bags paused near the sidewalk. One of the boys stopped dribbling. Curtains moved in several windows. Charles understood the reaction. His vehicle cost more than some of the residents earned in several years. Even without the company logo, he did not look like someone who belonged there. A gray-haired man in pressed trousers stood near the community notice board, stapling a paper beneath a broken plastic cover. Beside him was Annie. She had changed out of her airport blouse. She wore jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and old sneakers. A small bandage covered the back of her right heel. Annie saw Charles first. Her hand stopped against the notice board. Walter Green followed her gaze. "You know him? That's Charles Whitmore." Walter looked from her to the dark SUV and then back again. "The Charles Whitmore? The one whose file I returned." Charles approached slowly. Annie folded her arms. "You came. I said I would review the situation." "No. You said you had complete reports." Walter stepped forward and held out his hand. "Walter Green." Charles shook it. "Charles Whitmore." "I know." Walter's grip was firm, but not challenging. He carried himself like a man who did not confuse courtesy with submission. "I taught American history for 34 years, Walter said. "You learn a great deal about powerful men when you spend that long teaching what they did after they got power." Charles released his hand. "I'm here to look at the property." Walter glanced at the buildings. "Property is one word for it." "What word would you use?" "Home." Annie watched Charles, waiting to see if he would dismiss the answer. Instead, he looked toward Building C. "Apartment 214? Annie's expression tightened. "You remembered. It was in the file." "Of course it was." Walter picked up the stack of notices. "You should come inside before everyone decides you're here to hand out eviction papers." "I don't intend to hand out anything tonight. That will make you unusual for this project." Annie gave Walter a warning look, but Charles only nodded toward the nearest building. "Show me." They crossed the courtyard. The place needed work. Charles saw rust along the stair rails, water stains beneath several windows, patched concrete, and extension cords running where exterior outlets no longer worked. A maintenance request had been taped to the laundry room door. The date at the top was nearly 4 months old. Yet the courtyard was not neglected by the people who lived there. Someone had painted hopscotch squares on the pavement. Plastic planters lined the steps. A small wooden cabinet held children's books, canned soup, and 2 pairs of winter gloves. A woman in nursing scrubs passed them with a little girl asleep against her shoulder. "Evening, Mr. Green," she said. "Evening, Miss Johnson. Long shift?" 12 hours became 14. Walter took the grocery bag from her free hand and carried it to the bottom of the stairs. Charles watched the exchange. Walter handed the bag back. "This is Mr. Whitmore." The woman's tired expression changed. "Whitmore?" Charles answered before Walter could. "Yes." She adjusted the child against her shoulder. "Then you're the man telling us to leave. I'm reviewing the plan. My daughter's school is 6 blocks away. Her grandmother watches her when I work nights. Put that in your review." She went upstairs without waiting for an answer. Charles looked at Walter. "She is not usually rude," Walter said. "I didn't think she was." Annie glanced at him. It was the first response he had given that surprised her. Building C had no elevator. The stairwell smelled of detergent, fried onions, and old plaster. On the second floor, 1 bulb flickered above the landing. Annie unlocked apartment 214. Her mother stood in the kitchen wearing a pale blue cafeteria uniform and holding a dish towel. "Annie, who is?" She recognized Charles. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Denise placed the towel on the counter. "Mr. Whitmore." "Miss Carter." Annie looked between them. He wanted to see the building. Charles said, "Your daughter suggested I come. She does more than suggest when she believes she's right." "Mama." It wasn't criticism. Denise's tone was polite, though her posture remained guarded. She motioned toward the small table. "Would you like some tea?" Charles almost declined. He had eaten nothing since the flight, but accepting food in a stranger's home felt more intrusive than refusing it. Then he noticed Annie watching him. "Yes, thank you." Denise poured sweet tea into a glass that did not match the others. Charles sat at the table while Annie remained near the counter. The apartment was clean and worn. Paint had peeled around the window frame. The radiator knocked every few minutes. Family photographs covered one wall. Annie in elementary school. Annie at a middle school awards ceremony. Annie in a graduation gown beside Denise. Behind the sofa stood 3 cardboard boxes. One had been labeled winter clothes. Another held framed pictures wrapped in newspaper. The third was still empty. Charles looked at them. Denise noticed. "I'm sorting things." "Because of the relocation notice?" "Because I've lived long enough to know what words like preliminary mean when they come from a company with lawyers." Charles opened the file and found the compensation schedule. "You received an offer?" Denise pulled a folded letter from a kitchen drawer and placed it beside his hand. He read the figure twice. "This is the amount they sent you? That's the amount your company says is enough to start over. There should be additional moving assistance. There are deposits, application fees, higher rent, bus routes, and getting to work before 6 in the morning." Denise sat across from him. "That amount does not cover 6 months in a 2-bedroom apartment near my job." Charles looked toward Annie. "Why 2 bedrooms?" Denise's eyes hardened. "My daughter is 18, Mr. Whitmore. Being poor does not mean she stops deserving a door she can close." Charles lowered his gaze to the letter. Denise continued, "I've worked in an elementary school kitchen for 19 years. Before that, I cleaned offices at night. For a while, I did both. I'm not asking you to preserve every cracked wall. I'm asking why repairing a neighborhood has to begin by removing the people who kept living in it when no one else wanted it. The engineering reports describe serious deterioration. Have you read the original reports?" Charles did not answer immediately. Annie noticed the pause. Denise did too. "You signed the plan without reading all of them, didn't you?" "I reviewed the official packet." "That isn't what I asked." The radiator knocked beneath the window. Charles looked at the boxes again. For years, he had approved relocation budgets as percentages of acquisition costs. He had never pictured a mother deciding which photographs to wrap first. Denise folded her hands on the table. "Have you ever had to explain to your child that the place they call home is about to disappear?" Charles held her gaze. "No." "Then before you sign the next page, imagine having that conversation." Outside, a basketball struck the pavement 3 times, followed by a boy's laughter. Charles closed the file. "I need to review how this proposal was prepared." Annie leaned against the counter. "Review it or fix it? I won't promise something before I know the facts." "That didn't stop you from approving the demolition." "Annie," Denise said quietly. Charles stood. "She's right." The words seemed to surprise all 3 of them. He looked around the apartment once more, then picked up the compensation letter. "May I take a copy of this?" Denise went to the old printer near the hallway. "You may take a copy. The original stays here." Charles nodded. "That's reasonable." As he reached the door, Walter was waiting in the hall. "Well?" the older man asked. Charles looked down the stairwell, where patched walls and family voices carried from behind closed doors. "The buildings need work." Walter nodded. "No one here has denied that. But needing work and needing destruction are not the same conclusion." Annie studied his face, trying to decide whether the change was real or temporary. Charles descended the stairs with the copied letter inside the blue file. At the courtyard, he stopped beside the community cabinet. A handwritten note had been taped to the door. "Leave something when you can. Take something when you must." He read it twice. Back in the SUV, the driver asked whether to return to headquarters. Charles looked at the lit windows of Carter Heights. "Yes." He took out his phone and called Eleanor Price. "Pull the original structural assessments," he said, "not the executive summary. Every page, every appendix, and every version submitted before Marcus Lane's team finalized the packet." Eleanor paused. "Do you expect a discrepancy?" Charles looked up at apartment C 214. Annie stood behind the window, speaking with her mother. I expect to find out whether I approved a demolition because the buildings could not be saved, or because someone decided the people inside them were easier to remove. The SUV moved away from the curb. In the apartment above, Denise began folding the copied relocation letter along its old creases. Annie looked toward the 3 cardboard boxes behind the sofa. For the first time since they had arrived, none of them seemed quite ready to be sealed. By the time Charles returned to Whitmore Urban Development, the executive floor had gone quiet. The cleaning crew had begun working through the outer offices, emptying waste baskets and wiping fingerprints from glass walls. Inside Charles's office, however, the lights remained on. Eleanor Price was waiting beside the conference table with 3 binders, a laptop, and a stack of printed emails. "You found something," Charles said. "I found several things." He removed his jacket and placed the copied relocation letter from Denise Carter beside the dark blue file. Eleanor noticed it. "That came from Carter Heights, apartment C, 214. She did not ask what he had seen there. Charles's expression told her enough. Eleanor opened the first binder. "The structural survey you reviewed earlier was not the only version. This is the original assessment prepared 3 months ago. The official board packet contains a shortened summary." "How shortened?" 38 pages became 11. Charles pulled out a chair. "Show me what disappeared." Eleanor turned the binder toward him. The first missing section detailed the foundations of buildings A through D. The concrete required localized repairs, but the engineer had found no evidence of widespread structural failure. The next section listed options for replacing electrical systems without emptying all 6 buildings at once. Another showed how plumbing work could be completed in stages. Charles read each conclusion twice. 4 buildings can be renovated while occupied in sections, he said, with temporary relocation inside the complex, Eleanor replied. The 2 worst buildings would need to be emptied and replaced, but not all 6. And the cost? 47% of full demolition and reconstruction. Charles looked at her. Then why does the official report say renovation would cost almost the same as rebuilding? Because the official report includes projected delays, extended financing costs, and lost revenue from keeping rent below market for existing residents. That is not construction cost. No, it is reduced profit. Yes. The words settled between them. Charles leaned back and stared at the city beyond the windows. Earlier that evening, he had watched Denise Carter fold a relocation letter at a kitchen table beneath a knocking radiator. Now the same family appeared in Marcus Lane's spreadsheets as delayed revenue. Eleanor opened her laptop. There is more. The engineering firm submitted a mixed-income redevelopment option. It keeps most of the current residents, renovates 4 buildings, replaces 2, and adds market-rate units on the east side of the property. Why wasn't it presented? Marcus's team classified it as commercially inferior. Those exact words? Eleanor turned the screen toward him. The email was from Marcus to the project finance group. Do not include rehabilitation alternatives in the chairman's final packet. They do not meet target returns and will only complicate approval. Charles read the message without moving. Below it was another email. Mr. Whitmore expects decisions, not community relations delays. Present demolition as the only financially responsible path. Charles closed the laptop. Call Marcus. Eleanor glanced at the clock. It's after 10. He is still in the building. How do you know? Because a man who has hidden this much does not go home while I'm asking questions. Eleanor made the call. Marcus entered 7 minutes later. He had removed his tie, but his shirt collar remained buttoned. His expression was controlled until he saw the original engineering binders on the table. Then his steps slowed. You asked to see me, sir. Charles pointed to the chair across from him. Sit down. Marcus obeyed. Charles placed the original survey beside the official board packet. Explain the difference. Marcus looked at the documents. The longer version contains preliminary alternatives. We narrowed the material to the options that met investment requirements. You removed evidence that 4 buildings could be saved. We removed a plan that did not satisfy the return approved by the board. You called renovation impossible, financially impractical. You did not use those words in the packet. Marcus glanced at Eleanor. Legal reviewed the filing. I reviewed the final disclosures for compliance, Eleanor said. I was not informed that a viable engineering option had been removed. Marcus looked back at Charles. Nothing we submitted was false. Charles's voice stayed level. You told me the buildings could not be saved. I told you the project could not succeed under the rehabilitation model. Succeed for whom? Marcus exhaled through his nose. We are a development company, Charles. We are not a housing charity. Charles watched him. Marcus seemed to realize too late that he had used his first name. He straightened in the chair. Sir, the land is worth more cleared. The current rents do not support the required investment. If we retain most of the residents, the profit margin drops. Construction takes longer, and investors may walk. So you hid the option. You filtered it. You decided what I was allowed to see. I gave you the answer you have expected from me for 11 years. Charles's eyes narrowed. Marcus continued, more carefully now. Every project meeting begins with the same question. What is the final number? You reward teams that move quickly. You criticize hesitation. I built the packet around the standards you created. Eleanor remained silent. Charles looked down at Denise Carter's letter. Marcus had betrayed his responsibility. That was clear. Yet the defense was not entirely false. Charles had spent years telling people he valued honesty, while rewarding those who removed complications before they reached his desk. He had never ordered anyone to erase residents from a plan. He had simply made it profitable to do so. You should have told me, Charles said. Marcus gave a restrained shrug. Would you have chosen the lower return? Charles thought of Annie standing at the parking gate with blood on her heel. I don't know. Marcus leaned forward. Then do not destroy this project because an angry teenager made you uncomfortable. Charles's face hardened. She returned a file. Your team lost. And read confidential material. She had the chance to photograph it. She didn't. We only have her word. We have her actions. Marcus shook his head. You are allowing emotion to replace judgment. No. I am discovering that you replaced judgment with profit and called it loyalty. Charles pushed the official packet across the table. You are suspended from all approval authority on Carter Heights, effective tonight. Marcus stared at him. You can't be serious. Eleanor will secure the project files. No document is to be deleted, moved, or revised. Your access will be limited before you leave this floor. Marcus stood. The city hearing is tomorrow morning. Investors are already in Atlanta. The hearing is being postponed. You will trigger a review by the board. Then the board can review me. You could lose control of the company. Charles rose more slowly. And hundreds of people could lose their homes because I signed a summary designed to keep me from asking questions. Marcus looked toward Eleanor as if expecting support. She gave none. This is not over, he said. No, Charles replied. It is not. After Marcus left, Eleanor closed the door. You know he may be right about the board. Charles looked at the skyline. He was right about something worse. What? I taught him what kind of truth I was willing to hear. Eleanor gathered the emails into a separate folder. What do you want me to do next? Preserve every version of the project. Notify the city that our submission was incomplete. Then prepare a comparison of demolition, rehabilitation, and mixed-income redevelopment. For the board? For the residents first. Eleanor paused. That will be a change. It should have been the process from the beginning. Charles returned to the table and opened the blue file to the resident list. Denise Carter and Annie Carter remained halfway down the page, between apartment numbers and projected vacancy dates. He drew a line through the words full resident relocation on the cover sheet, not because the problem had been solved, because for the first time, he understood that the phrase had concealed more than it explained. Across town, Annie had gone to bed believing Charles might never return to Carter Heights. Before sunrise, his company would begin rewriting a plan that had already treated her community as if it were gone. By 7 the next morning, Annie was already awake. She had slept badly, waking twice from dreams in which she kept running but never reached the parking gate. When she finally gave up on sleep, the apartment was still dark. Denise stood in the kitchen, buttoning her cafeteria uniform with one hand and reading the relocation letter with the other. You're going to wear a hole through that paper, Annie said. Denise folded it. I could say the same about your shoes. Annie glanced at the bandage on her heel. They survived. Your foot didn't. Denise opened the refrigerator and took out 2 hard-boiled eggs she had brought home from the school kitchen. She placed one beside Annie's lunch bag. Eat that before your shift. I'm not hungry. That lie sounds better when I say it. Annie looked at her mother. Denise had already put on lipstick, something she did on difficult mornings because Annie's grandmother used to say a woman should never let bad news see her unprepared. Do you think he meant it? Annie asked. Who? You know who. Denise poured coffee into a travel mug. He came here. That doesn't mean he'll change anything. No, he could have come just to make himself feel better. He could have. Annie frowned. You're not helping. I'm trying not to build a future on one visit from a rich man. Denise picked up her lunch container and winced as she straightened. Annie noticed. You're back again? My back and I have an arrangement. It complains. I ignore it. That is not an arrangement. It has worked for 15 years. Annie reached for the pain reliever near the sink and handed it to her. Denise took one tablet, then rested her palm on Annie's cheek. Whatever Mr. Whitmore does next, you did what you could. I ran after a car. You stood your ground when 3 grown men treated you like a suspect. There were 2 men. The guard counts when he looks away. Denise picked up her bag. Go to work. Be polite. Do not apologize for something you did not do. Annie took the bus to the airport with her old sneakers in her bag. The morning crowd filled every seat. A construction worker slept with his arms folded. 2 nurses in scrubs discussed a patient who refused to take his blood pressure medicine. A woman near the front braided her daughter's hair while the bus moved. Annie watched Carter Heights disappear behind them and wondered whether Charles was already back in his office, surrounded by people explaining why every promise he made the night before was impossible. At the employee entrance, Pamela was waiting. Office. Now. Annie followed her past the service counters and into a small conference room near baggage services. A human resources representative named Mr. Bell sat at the table with a yellow folder. He motioned toward the empty chair. Have a seat, Miss Carter. Annie sat. Pamela remained standing near the door. Mr. Bell opened the folder. Yesterday, you left your assigned station without authorization. I was returning a confidential file to a passenger. You were instructed to leave it with airport security. I saw the owner's vehicle leaving. That does not change procedure. No, sir. Mr. Bell seemed surprised by the answer. You also crossed 3 public streets while on duty and entered a restricted parking area. I stopped at the gate. You attempted to contact a private customer outside the terminal. I returned his property. Pamela crossed her arms. Annie, no one is saying the file shouldn't have been returned. The issue is how you handled it. If I had left it at the lost and found counter and it disappeared, would I still be sitting here? Pamela sighed. That is not what happened. No, what happened is I gave it back. Mr. Bell glanced at Pamela, then returned to the form. Did you open the file? Only far enough to identify the owner. Did you photograph or copy any material? No. Did Mr. Whitmore accuse you of doing so? Annie's jaw tightened. He asked. That was not my question. He asked to have my phone searched. I refused. Pamela looked at her sharply. You did not mention that yesterday. No one asked. Mr. Bell wrote something down. Was there physical contact? One of his employees reached toward my pocket. I stepped away. Did he touch you? No. The answer seemed to relieve both adults more than it relieved Annie. Mr. Bell closed the folder halfway. Whitmore Urban Development contacted Airport Administration early this morning. Annie straightened. Are they filing a complaint? No. Mr. Whitmore's legal counsel confirmed that the file was returned intact and requested that no disciplinary decision be made until the circumstances were reviewed. Pamela's expression changed. Annie asked, why would his lawyer call? We don't know. Did he say anything else? Mr. Bell looked at the paper. The company accepted responsibility for failing to secure the file. For several seconds, Annie did not speak. Pamela pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. That helps you, but it doesn't erase the fact that you left your position. I understand. We're issuing a written warning and suspending you for 3 unpaid shifts. Annie stared at her. Unpaid? The internship stipend is based on hours worked. My mother and I use that money for groceries. Pamela's face softened, but her voice stayed formal. I understand this is difficult. No, ma'am. You understand the policy. Mr. Bell leaned forward. Miss Carter, the alternative under the program rules could be termination. Annie looked down at the table. 3 shifts meant bus fare, food, and part of the electric bill. It was not ruinous to someone like Charles Whitmore. In apartment C-214, it meant deciding which envelope waited another week. Do I sign something? She asked. Mr. Bell slid the warning form toward her. Annie read every line before signing. Pamela watched. You don't trust us? Walter Green's voice came back to her. Keep every letter. Every envelope, too. Dates matter. I trust what I read. She signed her name and requested a copy. When Annie left the office, several employees looked up from the counter. One quickly looked away. Another whispered something to the woman beside him. Annie returned to her station to collect her lunch bag and spare shoes. A coworker named Tasha followed her into the break room. "I heard you chased some billionaire through traffic." I returned his file. "That's not how people are telling it." "How are they telling it?" Tasha hesitated. "That you saw something about your apartment and tried to confront him." "I did confront him. You know what I mean." Annie shoved the old sneakers into her bag. "No. I know what they mean." Tasha lowered her voice. "Some people think you were trying to get money." Annie stopped. The accusation hurt less because it was new than because Charles had said the same thing before he knew anything about her. "What do you think?" Annie asked. Tasha looked uncomfortable. "I think you should be careful. People here already notice every mistake we make." Annie nodded. "That isn't an answer. It's the one I can afford to give." On the bus home, Annie sat near the rear door with the warning letter folded inside her bag. Outside, Atlanta moved past in office blocks, gas stations, churches, and apartment complexes with leasing banners tied to their fences. When she reached Carter Heights, a new notice had been taped to every building entrance. Walter stood in front of Building C, reading one aloud to Denise and 3 other residents. Whitmore Urban Development was postponing the city hearing and reviewing all relocation terms. At the bottom was a line Annie had not expected. No resident should sign a relocation agreement until further notice. Denise looked up as Annie approached. "He listened," she said. Annie read the notice twice. "No," she replied. "He started listening." Across downtown, Charles sat with Eleanor Price in front of 2 versions of the same project. One treated Carter Heights as land waiting to be cleared. The other treated it as a neighborhood worth rebuilding. By the end of the day, he would have to decide which version of progress carried his name. At 9 the next morning, the emergency meeting began on the 32nd floor of Whitmore Urban Development. Charles sat at the head of the conference table with the original engineering report open in front of him. Eleanor Price occupied the seat to his right. Across from them were the chief financial officer, the director of construction, 2 board representatives, and Marcus Lane, whose access to the Carter Heights files had been restricted but whose knowledge of the project still made his presence necessary. A model of the proposed development stood beneath the wall screen. 6 new apartment towers surrounded a glass retail center and landscaped plaza. The model included miniature trees, cafe tables, and tiny figures walking along clean sidewalks. It did not include a single current resident. Charles looked at it for several seconds before speaking. "Take that out." The director of construction glanced toward the model. "Sir, remove it from the room." 2 assistants carried it away. Marcus watched them go with his jaw set. Charles turned to the screen. "We have 2 viable plans. Full demolition, which was presented to me as the only practical option, and phased rehabilitation, which was removed from the final packet." The chief financial officer cleared his throat. "The rehabilitation plan is technically possible, but the returns are significantly lower." "How much lower?" "Depending on the rent protections, between 18 and 26% over the first 7 years. "Still profitable?" "Yes, but below the threshold approved by several investors." Marcus leaned forward. "That threshold exists for a reason. If we redesign now, we delay construction, reopen financing, and signal that community pressure can overturn a signed development strategy." Charles looked at him. The strategy was signed using an incomplete report. The report contained the recommended option. It contained the option that produced your bonus. The room went quiet. Marcus's expression tightened. "My compensation is based on project performance, like everyone else's. And project performance was defined only by speed and profit. That definition came from this office." Charles did not deny it. "Yes," he said, "it did." The answer unsettled the room more than an accusation would have. He continued, "That is why this review is not limited to Marcus Lane. We are examining how the entire project was approved, including my own decisions." One of the board representatives, Harold Wexler, removed his glasses. "Charles, accepting responsibility is admirable, but we need to protect the company. If this becomes public before we have a controlled response, the city could freeze the project." "The city should freeze it." Harold stared at him. Charles slid copies of Denise Carter's relocation letter across the table. "This is what one family received. The amount does not cover 6 months of comparable rent near the mother's job. The financial officer looked at the letter. The figure meets the statutory minimum. Charles's gaze hardened. I am tired of hearing minimum used, as though it means sufficient. Harold tapped the page with one finger. We are not a public housing agency. No, we are the company removing the housing. Marcus shook his head. This is exactly what happens when a personal story enters a financial decision. One family becomes the face of the project, and suddenly every number is treated as cruel. Charles turned toward him. Those numbers describe people. They describe obligations. They describe whether a woman can stay close enough to keep her job. Marcus exhaled. And there are hundreds of investors, employees, and contractors depending on this project. Their lives count too. They do, Charles said. Which is why we will build something that remains profitable without pretending demolition is the only answer. The construction director opened the rehabilitation report. If we phase the work, buildings A through D can be repaired one section at a time. Residents would need temporary units, but many could remain within the complex. Buildings E and F should be replaced. How long? 30 to 36 months. The demolition plan? 18 to 24. And the mixed income addition? We could build market rate units on the east parcel to offset part of the reduced rent. Charles nodded. Develop that option. Marcus laughed once under his breath. Charles looked at him. Something amusing? You are redesigning a $400 million development because an 18-year-old challenged you in a parking garage. No, I am redesigning it because your team hit a viable plan. Marcus leaned back. And if the girl had never found the file? Charles paused. Then I would have signed it. No one spoke. That, Charles said, is the problem. Across the city. Annie sat at the kitchen table with the airport's disciplinary letter in front of her. The unpaid suspension had begun that morning, leaving her with 3 empty days and no stipend. Denise had gone to work before sunrise. On the refrigerator, she had left a note beneath Annie's community college brochure. Eat the egg. Call the electric company. Do not spend all day worrying. Annie ate the egg and called the electric company. The representative granted them 7 extra days. Then she carried a folding chair into the courtyard, where Walter Green had arranged a table beneath the old community notice board. A dozen residents gathered around him. Some held the postponement notice from Whitmore Urban Development. Others carried relocation letters and handwritten questions. A woman named Lillian Price waved the notice in Walter's direction. They say don't sign anything. Does that mean the project is canceled? No, Walter replied. It means the company is reviewing it. So we are supposed to wait? We are supposed to use the time. A man in a work uniform shook his head. Use it for what? Lawyers? We don't have money for lawyers. We have the right to request information, Walter said. And we can document what relocation would cost each household. Annie placed a stack of blank forms on the table. I made these last night. Walter looked at her. What are they? Household information, rent, jobs, schools, transportation, medical needs, how long people have lived here. Lillian frowned. Why should we give another list of our business to people who already want us gone? We don't give it to the company, Annie said. We keep it here. They count apartments. We need to show what those apartments are connected to. A man near the back crossed his arms. You're the girl who found the file. Annie nodded. Did you read the whole thing? No. Did you take pictures? No. Then how do we know what they're planning? We know what they sent us. We know the compensation they offered. And we know they postponed the hearing after Mr. Whitmore came here. The man gave a doubtful shrug. Maybe he came to protect himself. Maybe. Annie did not defend Charles. We should act as though no one is coming to save us. Walter looked at her with quiet approval. Lillian sat down. What do you need from me? Annie handed her a form. Start with where you work and whether you have a car. I don't. How do you get to work? Route 78, then the train. If you move farther south, I lose the train connection. Annie wrote it down. One by one, the others began speaking. A retired veteran needed to remain near the VA clinic. A grandmother cared for 2 children whose school was within walking distance. A warehouse worker began his shift before the first bus ran. A woman on the 3rd floor depended on neighbors to carry groceries because the elevator in Building A had been broken for months. The information did not look dramatic on paper. It was bus routes, work schedules, prescriptions, school districts, and names of people who held spare keys. Together, it explained why relocation was not as simple as changing an address. Near noon, a silver sedan entered the courtyard. Eleanor Price stepped out carrying a briefcase. Conversation stopped. She approached the table. "Miss Carter?" Annie rose. "Yes? My name is Eleanor Price. I'm legal counsel for Whitmore Urban Development." Walter moved closer but allowed Annie to answer. "What do you want?" "To invite representatives from Carter Heights to a planning meeting." "When?" "Tomorrow afternoon." Annie looked at the residents around her. "Representatives chosen by whom?" "By the community." "And will we see the original engineering report?" Eleanor paused, then nodded. "Yes." "The compensation calculations?" "Yes." "The plan that keeps people here?" "If the residents agree to attend, all current options will be presented." Walter asked, "Will Marcus Lane be in the room?" "He will not control the meeting." "That was not the question." Eleanor met his eyes. "He may attend because he managed the project, but he no longer has approval authority." Annie folded her arms. "Why should we trust that?" "You should not trust a statement simply because I work for the company," Eleanor said. "Ask for it in writing." Walter's expression softened slightly. Eleanor opened her briefcase and removed a letter. "So I brought it in writing." Annie read every line before passing it to Walter. At the bottom was Charles Whitmore's signature. The meeting would include resident representatives, independent engineers, legal counsel, and city housing staff. No relocation agreement would be accepted until the review ended. Lillian whispered, "Does this mean we won?" Annie looked toward the 6 buildings around them. "No," she said. "It means we finally got into the room." Downtown, Charles ended the emergency meeting with one instruction. "Tomorrow, no one presents Carter Heights as empty land." For the first time since the project began, the people who lived there would be present when its value was discussed. The following afternoon, Annie entered Whitmore Urban Development through a revolving glass door that reflected her from 3 angles at once. She wore the same navy blouse she used at the airport, though the internship badge was no longer clipped to it. Walter walked beside her in a brown jacket and pressed trousers, carrying a folder filled with household forms. Denise had wanted to come, but the elementary school kitchen was short-staffed, and missing another shift would have reduced her paycheck. "Remember," Walter said as they approached the security desk, "we came to listen, ask questions, and take notes." "I know. And if somebody talks down to you, I ask them to repeat it slowly so everyone hears." Walter looked at her. Annie gave him a small smile. "I'm joking. Try to keep it that way." Eleanor Price met them in the lobby. She handed both of them temporary visitor badges and led them to an elevator. 2 other Carter Heights residents were already upstairs. Lillian Price, who relied on public transportation to reach her hotel housekeeping job, and Raymond Ellis, a retired Army mechanic who received treatment at the Atlanta VA Medical Center. They had been selected during a community meeting the night before. The conference room overlooked downtown Atlanta. Bottled water, coffee, and boxed lunches had been arranged along one wall. Annie noticed the difference immediately. When wealthy people expected a long meeting, someone made sure they would not go hungry. Charles stood near the windows speaking with the construction director. He looked toward Annie when she entered, but he did not approach her. Marcus Lane sat at the far end of the table. His access badge had been replaced by a red visitor pass. He looked at Annie as if her presence confirmed something unpleasant. Eleanor directed the residents to seats near the middle rather than at the end. "This meeting is being recorded," she said. "Everyone will receive the minutes and copies of the materials presented today." Walter placed his folder on the table. "Including the original engineering report?" "Including all versions relevant to the decision." Charles took his seat. "Let's begin." The construction director displayed a map of Carter Heights. Buildings A through D were marked in yellow. Buildings E and F were red. "The first engineering team found that 4 buildings can be renovated," he explained. "The remaining 2 have serious foundation and drainage problems. Replacement is the safer option." Lillian raised her hand, then seemed embarrassed by the gesture. "You don't need permission to speak," Charles said. She lowered her hand. "If E and F are torn down, where do those families go?" "We would relocate them temporarily." "Temporarily where?" The director looked at his notes. "That has not been finalized." "Then it isn't a plan," Lillian said. "It is a word." Walter wrote something on his legal pad. The director continued. The rehabilitation option would take longer but allow most residents to remain at Carter Heights during construction. Vacant units could be repaired first, then used as temporary housing while occupied sections were renovated. Raymond leaned forward. How many vacant units? 27. Usable? Not currently. So your temporary housing needs repairs before the other repairs begin. That is correct. How long? Approximately 4 months. Marcus interrupted. This is why the phased plan was not recommended. Every additional stage creates delays and costs. Full demolition is cleaner. Annie turned toward him. Cleaner for whom? Marcus ignored her and addressed Charles. The full plan creates more housing, more retail space, and stronger tax revenue. We are allowing individual hardship to distract from the larger benefit. Walter closed his pen. A larger benefit should be large enough to include the people already there. Marcus gave him a restrained smile. Mr. Green, development cannot preserve every personal arrangement. Raymond's voice remained calm. My treatment at the VA is not a personal arrangement, Lillian added. Neither is the bus I take to work. Annie opened Walter's folder and distributed copies of the household survey. 83 families had responded in less than a day. The pages showed how many residents depended on nearby schools, bus lines, medical facilities, and informal childcare. It also showed that many households could not qualify for apartments elsewhere because they lacked savings for deposits or had incomes below management requirements. Marcus glanced at the first page. This was not independently verified. It was collected yesterday, Annie said. We didn't claim it was audited. Then it cannot guide a $400 million decision. It can tell you which questions your $400 million decision forgot to ask. Charles looked at the survey longer than Marcus did. How many households have children in the local school district? He asked. 31, Annie said. How many residents do not own cars? 46 households. And medical access? 17 people reported regular appointments they reach by bus or through neighbors. The construction director asked for a copy. Annie handed one over. Eleanor then presented the compensation structure. The minimum payment was based on lease status, unit size, and estimated moving costs. It did not account for increased rent after relocation, deposits, changes in transportation, or lost work hours. Denise's letter appeared on the screen with her name removed. Lillian stared at the number. That wouldn't get me into another apartment. The financial officer said, it complies with current requirements. Walter looked across the table. Do you ever notice how often the word requirement appears when people are explaining why they cannot do more? Charles shifted his gaze toward the financial officer. What would 12 months of comparable rent cost? Across all households? Yes. The man entered figures into his laptop. Depending on location and unit size, between $4.8 and $6.1 million. Marcus leaned forward. That does not include deposits, transportation, or administrative costs. We cannot build a relocation budget around every inconvenience. Annie's eyes narrowed. Losing your home is not an inconvenience. Marcus looked at her visitor badge. You are here as a resident representative, not a development expert. And you were the development expert who hid the report. The room went silent. Marcus's face hardened. Be careful. Charles spoke before Annie could answer. She does not need a warning from you. Marcus turned toward him. Charles, this meeting has become theater. No, Charles said. The theater was the presentation where Carter Heights had trees, cafes, and no residents. The construction director lowered his eyes. Charles stood and walked to the screen. We are not approving either proposal today. The demolition plan was built on incomplete information. The rehabilitation plan lacks a workable relocation schedule. Both need revision. Walter asked, who will revise them? A joint planning group. Engineers, city housing staff, legal counsel, and elected resident representatives. Elected by the residents? Annie asked. Yes. And they see all documents? Yes. Marcus pushed his chair back. You are handing project control to tenants with no financial expertise. Charles looked at him. No. I am giving affected residents a place in decisions you assumed they were too powerless to question. Marcus stood. Investors will not accept this. Then I will explain it to them. You could lose the project. Charles glanced at Annie, then at the household form spread across the table. We nearly lost more than that. Marcus left without asking permission. The meeting continued for another hour. Dates were set, documents requested, and a temporary stop placed on all relocation agreements. Nothing had been saved yet, but for the first time, residents would see the plan before being told to accept it. In the elevator afterward, Lillian pressed the lobby button. "Do you trust him?" she asked Annie. "No." Walter raised an eyebrow. Annie continued. "But I believe he knows we're watching now." When the doors opened, Eleanor was waiting with copies of the minutes. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to tell you the city hearing will remain postponed." Walter accepted the papers. "Tell him postponement is not protection." "I will." Outside, rain had begun falling across downtown Atlanta. Walter opened his umbrella over Annie and Lillian, while Raymond pulled his cap lower. Back on the 32nd floor, Charles stood alone beside the empty space where the polished development model had been displayed. On the table lay Annie's survey. 83 households described not by unit numbers, but by the lives connected to them. For the first time, the Carter Heights project was becoming harder to summarize. That was precisely why it was becoming more honest. The first letters arrived at Carter Heights 2 days after the meeting downtown. They came in white envelopes marked time-sensitive relocation option and were pushed beneath doors before most residents left for work. By 7 in the morning, Walter Green had 3 copies spread across the folding table in the courtyard. Annie stood beside him with a cup of instant coffee growing cold in her hand. "They said all relocation agreements were frozen," she said. Walter adjusted his glasses. "These are not called agreements." Annie read the first paragraph again. Residents who signed an early acceptance form within 10 calendar days would receive an additional moving allowance, assistance with truck rental, and priority consideration at another apartment complex owned by a Whitmore affiliate. The final paragraph was more careful. Those who declined might no longer qualify for the same incentives after the review period. "They made it sound optional," Annie said. "It is optional." Walter tapped the last sentence. "Fear usually is." By 8, the courtyard had filled with residents holding identical envelopes. Some wore work uniforms. Others had come outside in robes and house shoes. Parents stood with children waiting for the school bus while reading language written by people who knew how to make pressure sound like an opportunity. Lillian Price folded her letter against her chest. The extra money would cover a deposit. "And after the deposit?" Annie asked. "I don't know." A man from Building E stepped forward. His name was Curtis Bell, and he worked nights at a warehouse near the airport. "My wife is pregnant. I'm not risking the company changing its mind because people here want to fight a billionaire." "No one is asking you to risk your family," Walter said. "That is exactly what you're asking." Curtis held up the letter. "This says 10 days. If I wait and the deal falls apart, who pays my moving costs? You?" Walter did not answer. Annie understood the anger. Curtis was not defending the company. He was trying to protect the only certainty placed in front of him. A woman in her 60s named Mrs. Dalton spoke from the edge of the group. "You're 18, Annie. If this goes wrong, you can start somewhere else. Some of us are too old to gamble." The words landed harder because Annie knew they were true. "I'm not telling anyone what to sign," she said. "I'm asking why they're giving us 10 days while the project is supposed to be under review." "Because they want an answer," Curtis replied. "No, they want separate answers before we can make one together." A few people nodded. Others looked away. Denise came out of Building C carrying her lunch bag. She had to leave for the school kitchen, but stopped when she saw the crowd. "What happened?" Annie handed her the letter. Denise read it without speaking. "The extra allowance would help," she said at last. Annie stared at her. "You're considering it?" "I'm considering everything." But Charles said no one should sign. Charles Whitmore does not live here. He ordered a review. And his company sent this. Walter took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "It may have been prepared before the freeze." "Then why did it arrive today?" Annie asked. No one had an answer. Across town, Charles was asking the same question. Eleanor Price entered his office holding a copy of the letter and a distribution report. 412 notices were mailed Monday evening, she said. They were processed through a relocation contractor before Marcus's authority was formally suspended. "Can they be withdrawn?" "The paper cannot. We can issue a correction." Charles read the language twice. "Who approved the 10-day deadline?" "Marcus's deputy signed the release. He claims the mailing was already scheduled." "And Marcus?" "He says he had no authority after suspension." "That was not my question." Eleanor closed the folder. The draft originated from his office. Charles walked to the window. Below, traffic moved through downtown in slow lines. He knew exactly what he was doing. He may argue the offer gives residents more choice. It gives them less time. Eleanor nodded. Yes. Charles turned from the glass. Cancel the incentives. That could harm families already planning to accept. Then preserve the money and remove the deadline. We'll need revised language. Send a notice today. No resident loses assistance by waiting for the review. Eleanor hesitated. The board will see this as another concession. It is not a concession to stop using uncertainty as leverage. Charles picked up the phone. Get me the relocation contractor. At Carter Heights, the school bus had come and gone. Most adults had left for work, but the argument continued in smaller groups. Annie helped Walter move the table into the community room before rain started. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed above rows of folding chairs. On the back wall hung photographs from neighborhood events. Thanksgiving dinners, youth basketball teams, retirement parties, and children standing beside science fair projects. Walter looked at the pictures. You know what people misunderstand about communities like this? What? They think hardship brings everyone together. Annie placed the letters in separate piles. Doesn't it? Sometimes. Other times it makes each person count what they can afford to lose. He sat down slowly. Do not judge the people who sign. I don't. You will be tempted. Annie looked toward the door where Curtis had stood. He thinks I'm asking him to risk his baby's future. He is afraid. So am I. Yes, but fear speaks differently through different people. Walter handed her one of the household surveys. If we want people to wait, we need more than speeches. We need facts. Available apartments, actual rents, transportation costs, school changes. Let them see what the early payment buys. For the next 4 hours, Annie called apartment complexes across South Atlanta. Some had waiting lists. Some required income 3 times the monthly rent. Several charged application fees that were non-refundable. One leasing agent asked whether the residents had prior evictions. Another said the property did not accept relocation vouchers. A 2-bedroom apartment near Denise's job cost nearly twice their current rent. Annie wrote every number down. By early afternoon, her notebook showed what the company's letter did not. The extra allowance might open a door, but many residents could not afford to keep it open. The community room door swung inward. Marcus Lane entered wearing a dark overcoat. Walter stood. You are not invited. Marcus removed his gloves. I'm here as a representative of residents who requested clarification. Which residents? Those who do not want their interests held hostage by a committee. Annie rose from the table. You sent the letters. I helped create an option. With a 10-day deadline, people deserve the right to move forward. Before they see the new plan, Marcus looked at her. You have become very comfortable speaking about matters beyond your experience. And you became comfortable deciding people would leave because they were too scared to question you. His expression hardened. I would be careful, Miss Carter. Public attention fades. Bills do not. Walter stepped between them. That sounds like a warning. It is advice. Marcus placed a stack of forms on the table. Several families are ready to sign. The company has legal obligations to honor their choice. Annie looked at the forms, then at him. You're trying to divide the neighborhood. I am acknowledging reality. Not everyone wants to spend months fighting to remain in a deteriorating building. Before Annie could answer, Walter's phone rang. He listened for less than a minute, then put it on speaker. Eleanor Price's voice filled the room. Mr. Green, Whitmore Urban Development has withdrawn the 10-day deadline. All moving assistance will remain available until the review is complete. A written correction is being delivered today. Marcus's face changed. Eleanor continued. No resident will lose benefits by waiting. Walter looked directly at Marcus. Did you hear that? Marcus collected the unsigned forms. This does not change the economics. No, Annie said. It changes who gets time to understand them. He left without another word. That evening, the revised notices appeared under every door. Some residents still planned to move. Others remained unsure. Carter Heights had not become united simply because one deadline disappeared. But the decision no longer belonged to fear alone. From the window of apartment C 214, Annie watched neighbors gather beneath the courtyard lights, comparing both letters line by line. For years, decisions about Carter Heights had arrived in envelopes. Now the people receiving them had begun answering back. The next morning, Carter Heights woke to two different versions of the same future. The first was the original 10-day relocation notice, still folded on kitchen tables and tucked into work bags. The second was the correction delivered the night before, promising that no resident would lose assistance by waiting. For some families, the correction brought relief. For others, it confirmed that the company could change the rules whenever it wanted. Annie found Curtis Bell near the mailboxes before sunrise. He wore his warehouse jacket and held both letters in one hand. "My wife still wants to sign," he said. Annie stopped beside him. "Then you should read everything and decide what works for your family. You're not going to tell me to wait? I think you should, but I don't have to live with your decision." Curtis looked toward Building E. A light was on in his second-floor apartment. "She's due in 11 weeks. We need somewhere stable before the baby comes." "I understand." "No, you don't." Annie accepted the words without defending herself. Curtis sighed. "That came out wrong. It came out scared." He folded the letters together. "You sound like Mr. Green. I've been spending too much time with him." Curtis almost smiled. Before Annie could say more, her phone rang. The airport's human resources office appeared on the screen. "Miss Carter," Mr. Bell said when she answered, "we need you to come in this morning. I'm still suspended. This concerns your placement in the internship program." The formal tone told her the decision had already been made. Denise had left for work, so Annie placed the two notices on the kitchen table and took the bus alone. She wore her navy blouse but left the internship badge in her bag. At the airport, travelers moved past her with coffee cups, neck pillows, and carry-on bags. Nothing in the terminal had changed because she had run 3 streets, lost 3 shifts, or helped hundreds of residents delay a decision that could remove them from their homes. Pamela and Mr. Bell were waiting in the same conference room. This time, a second human resources representative joined them by video call. Anya sat down. Mr. Bell folded his hands. "After reviewing the incident, airport administration has decided to end your internship placement." Annie looked at Pamela. "You said the alternative to suspension was termination." "I accepted the suspension. Additional concerns were raised," Pamela said. "By whom? We cannot discuss internal communications." "Did Whitmore Urban Development file a complaint?" "No," Mr. Bell answered. "Their legal counsel requested that we not discipline you based on the content of the file." "Then what changed?" The representative on the screen spoke. "Your continued involvement in the Carter Heights matter creates a conflict with your role at the airport. You are now publicly associated with a dispute involving a VIP customer." "I live there. We understand." "No, you understand that my address is inconvenient." Pamela leaned forward. "Annie, this is not about your race or your neighborhood." "I didn't say it was." The room went quiet. Annie continued. "But you felt the need to say that before I did." Mr. Bell pushed a document across the table. "The program is discretionary. This does not appear on a permanent employment record. It was supposed to help me get a permanent job." Pamela's expression softened. "I'm willing to provide a reference confirming your work with passengers, but not what happened. I can confirm that you were helpful, punctual, and professional, except when doing the right thing became embarrassing." Pamela looked down. Annie read the termination form from beginning to end. She did not sign the section agreeing that the decision was fair. She signed only to confirm receipt and requested a copy. Before leaving, she removed the internship badge from her bag and placed it on the table. Pamela touched it with one finger. "You can keep it." Annie shook her head. "Not today." She walked through the terminal without crying. She passed the customer support counter where a new intern was helping an elderly couple print boarding passes. For a moment, Annie wanted to stop and warn the girl to follow every rule, even when the rules failed the person standing in front of her. Instead, she kept walking. At Whitmore Urban Development, Charles sat with Eleanor in a smaller conference room secured by the legal department. The table held printed emails, document histories, financial schedules, and access logs recovered from the Carter Heights project server. Eleanor pointed to a chain of messages. Marcus did more than remove the rehabilitation report. He instructed the relocation contractor to accelerate early agreements before the city hearing. Charles read the message. The more units committed before review, the harder it becomes to justify changing course. Use the incentive window. Another email ordered staff to classify long-term residents as low-retention occupants, a category that reduced projected relocation expenses. Charles looked up. "What does low retention mean?" It means the model assumes they will accept payment and leave without requesting a return option. Based on what? Income, lease history, age, and access to legal representation. Charles stared at her. They measured who was least able to fight. Eleanor did not soften the answer. Yes. She opened another file. There is also evidence Marcus delayed repairs during the acquisition period. Charles's chair moved back slightly. What repairs? Roof leaks, exterior lighting, plumbing, and the elevator in Building A. His team argued that major repairs would reduce the financial justification for demolition, so they allowed the property to deteriorate, then used the deterioration as evidence it could not be saved. That appears to be the pattern. Charles rose and walked to the window. Below him, the city looked orderly from 32 floors up. Traffic became lines. Buildings became shapes. People disappeared entirely. Bring Marcus in. He has retained personal counsel. Then his counsel can sit beside him. Eleanor studied Charles. You need to decide whether this is an internal employment matter or something we refer for external investigation. It became more than an employment matter when they manipulated conditions affecting hundreds of tenants. 20 minutes later, Marcus entered with an attorney. He remained standing until Charles pointed toward a chair. Eleanor placed copies of the emails in front of him. Marcus read the first page and gave no visible reaction. Charles spoke. You accelerated relocation agreements after I ordered a review. I followed the existing project schedule. You described residents as low retention because they lack the resources to challenge us. That is standard risk analysis. You delayed repairs. Marcus looked toward his attorney. The attorney answered, My client disputes that characterization. Charles pushed the maintenance email forward. Your name is on it. Marcus finally looked at Charles. Repairs were deferred because acquisition was expected. Spending millions on buildings scheduled for demolition would have been irresponsible. Then you cited those unrepaired conditions to justify demolition. The buildings were failing. You helped them fail. Marcus leaned back. You approved the strategy. I approved the packet you altered. You approved a culture where nobody brought you a plan with lower returns. Charles held his gaze. You used what you knew about me to excuse what you chose to do. Marcus's voice hardened. Do not pretend this company was built on community meetings. You wanted speed. You wanted margins. You wanted people who solved problems before they reached your desk. And you decided people were the problem. Marcus said nothing. Charles continued. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Your compensation connected to Carter Heights is frozen pending investigation. Every project you supervised will be independently reviewed. Marcus's attorney began to speak, but Charles raised one hand. This meeting is over. Marcus stood. At the door, he turned back. You think that girl saved you? Charles answered without hesitation. No, she showed me what I had allowed. By late afternoon, Annie sat alone on the steps outside Building C with the termination letter folded beside her. Denise returned from work and saw the airport badge missing from her daughter's blouse. They let you go. Annie nodded. Denise sat beside her despite the pain in her back. I did everything they asked until the one time I did something they didn't know how to classify. Her mother took the letter and read it. Do you regret returning the file? Annie looked across the courtyard at the families carrying groceries home, children getting off the school bus, and Walter collecting signed surveys. No. Then don't let them turn the price of your decision into proof that it was wrong. Annie leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. Across town, Marcus Lane left Whitmore Urban Development through a side entrance. At Carter Heights, Annie remained on the front steps of the only home she had ever known. Both had lost their positions that day. Only one of them had lost it for telling the truth. The morning after Annie lost her internship, she woke before the alarm and lay still, listening to the pipes knock behind the kitchen wall. For a few seconds, she forgot what had happened. Then she saw the folded termination letter on the chair beside her bed. The airport badge was gone. The navy blouse hung on the closet door as if it still belonged to someone with somewhere to report. Annie got up, dressed in sweatpants and an old Carter Heights high school t-shirt, then went into the kitchen. Denise had already left for work. On the table sat a covered plate, a boiled egg, and a note written on the back of a grocery receipt. Eat. Call the electric company. Do not spend all day worrying. Annie read it twice. Behind the sofa, the 3 cardboard boxes had changed. Denise had sealed the one holding winter clothes. A strip of brown packing tape ran across the top. Annie touched it. Her mother had not said they were leaving. She had not needed to. Annie called the electric company and arranged another short extension. Then she searched apartment listings on Denise's old laptop. The screen took several seconds to load each page. The first apartment required a deposit equal to 2 months' rent. The second was 23 miles from Denise's school. The third had no bus stop nearby. The fourth advertised affordable units, but the waiting list was 18 months long. Annie wrote the numbers in a notebook. 2-bedroom rent, $1,680. Application fee, $75 per adult. Security deposit, $1,500. Proof of income, 3 times monthly rent. She stopped writing. Denise's take-home pay did not meet the requirement. Annie no longer had internship income to add to the application. She closed the laptop and looked at the boxes. At noon, Walter knocked and entered carrying a foil-covered dish. "Mrs. Dalton sent peach cobbler," he said. "We didn't ask for anything. That has never stopped Mrs. Dalton." He placed the dish on the counter, then looked toward the sealed box. She started taping them. Annie sat at the kitchen table. "She says she's preparing." Walter lowered himself into the chair across from her. "Your mother has spent most of her life preparing for problems before they reached you." "I know. No. You know she works hard." "That is not the same as knowing how often she has been afraid." Annie looked down at the apartment listings. Walter turned the notebook toward himself and read the figures. "You have been calling places? Most won't take us." "Did they say why?" "They say income requirements, waiting lists, no vacancies. They never say people like us. They do not need to." Annie closed the notebook. "I did the right thing, Mr. Green." "Yes. I returned the file. I didn't take pictures. I didn't ask for money. I told the truth. Now I have no job, and we may still lose the apartment." Walter nodded. Annie's voice tightened. "You're supposed to tell me it will work out. I taught history, Miss Carter. History does not allow me to make promises that cheaply." She looked away. Walter removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. "When I was 32, the school board tried to close the high school where I taught. They said enrollment was down and the building cost too much. We believed that if we explained why the school mattered, they would listen." "Did they?" "Not at first." "What changed?" "We stopped asking them to care and started making it difficult for them not to answer." Walter counted on his fingers. "We collected records, bus times, graduation rates, property agreements. We found out the replacement school was farther away and already overcrowded. Parents attended every meeting. Teachers filed requests. Students wrote letters." "Did you save it?" "For 12 years. Only 12? That was 12 graduating classes who would not have had it otherwise." Annie leaned back. Walter put on his glasses. "Justice begins quietly. In a person deciding not to lie, not to steal, not to look away. But if it is going to survive outside the conscience, it needs records, witnesses, and people willing to stand together." "What if people don't stand together?" "They rarely do at first. Some residents want to sign. They are scared." "Soigné." "Yes, fear just speaks differently through different mouths." Walter stood and walked toward the boxes. "Your mother sees tape and labels as control. You see them as surrender. Aren't they?" "No, they are cardboard." Annie looked at him. "Do not give objects more authority than they deserve." He tapped the sealed box lightly. "Your mother can prepare for leaving and still fight to stay." That afternoon, Annie carried a folding table into the community room. Walter brought legal pads and pens. Lillian arrived after her hotel shift. Raymond brought a thermos of coffee. Curtis Bell came with his wife Keisha, who was 7 months pregnant. They began preparing for the city hearing that had been rescheduled for the following week. Annie organized the work into categories: schools, transportation, medical access, employment, grand comparaison, temporary housing, right to return. Walter reviewed every resident statement to remove repetition. Raymond contacted the VA transportation office. Lillian mapped the bus routes she used for work. Keisha gathered information about prenatal care and pediatric clinics near Carter Heights. No one gave speeches. They made calls, checked numbers, and stapled documents. At 5, Denise entered wearing her cafeteria uniform and carrying 2 trays of leftover macaroni and cheese. "You all planning to stay until breakfast?" Walter lifted the lid. "Not if you keep feeding us." Denise placed paper plates on the table. She looked at Annie's notes. What are you doing? Preparing for the hearing. You lost your job yesterday. I know. You should be filling out applications. I did. And? No one has hired me since lunch. Denise gave her a tired look. Annie softened her voice. I'll keep applying. But I'm not walking away from this. Denise sat beside her. Baby, you do not have to save the whole neighborhood. I'm not trying to save it alone. That is what people say before they carry everyone's weight. Annie looked around the room. Lillian was explaining a bus transfer to Raymond. Curtis was writing the distance from Carter Heights to his warehouse. Walter was teaching Keisha how to request a copy of the city's housing impact assessment. I'm not carrying it alone. Denise followed her gaze. For the first time, she saw not a group of frightened tenants, but a room of people learning how to answer a company that had expected silence. Downtown, Charles sat with Eleanor and the finance team reviewing the consequences of changing the project. The mixed income plan would reduce projected returns. Redesign costs would be substantial. 2 investors had threatened to withdraw. 3 board members demanded an emergency vote on Charles's leadership. Eleanor placed the figures in front of him. If you proceed, the company may lose more than $100 million in expected value. Expected value, Charles repeated. The investors will not accept a moral argument. They will accept a legal and financial plan. And if they do not, Charles looked at the 2 project models on the screen. Then they leave. Eleanor studied him. You may lose the chairmanship. I know. Are you prepared for that? Charles thought of Denise's question, Annie's bleeding heel, and the boxes behind the sofa. No, he said, but the families at Carter Heights were not prepared to lose their homes either. He closed the demolition proposal. Prepare both reports for the hearing. Nothing hidden, nothing summarized beyond recognition. Eleanor nodded. And Charles? Yes? When you speak, do not say you were misled as though that ends your responsibility. He met her eyes. I won't. That evening, Denise finally sealed the second box. On the top, she wrote kitchen. Annie watched, then handed her the marker. Write coming back home. Denise looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then beneath kitchen, she added 3 words. Coming back home. The boxes remained by the sofa, still capable of carrying their lives away. But for the first time, they also carried the possibility of return. The city hearing began at 9 the next morning in a chamber designed to make ordinary people feel small. The ceiling was high, the walls were paneled in dark wood, and the council members sat behind a curved desk raised above everyone else. Rows of metal-framed chairs filled quickly. Carter Heights residents arrived in church vans, city buses, borrowed cars, and a school minibus Walter had arranged through a local pastor. Many of the older residents wore their Sunday clothes. Walter came in wearing a navy suit he had owned for nearly 20 years. Denise wore a dark green dress beneath a black cardigan, though she had worked until late the night before. Lillian had pinned her hair back and carried 3 folders. Raymond wore his Army service pin on his jacket. Annie sat between her mother and Walter with a binder on her lap. Inside were bus schedules, rent comparisons, medical appointment maps, school enrollment records, resident statements, and the 2 relocation notices. Her old internship badge lay in the front pocket. Denise noticed it when Annie opened the binder. Why did you bring that? I don't know. Yes, you do. Annie touched the plastic edge. Because that little card is the reason half the people in this room think I'm too young to understand what's happening. Denise looked toward the council desk. Then make them understand without asking permission. At the front of the chamber, Charles sat beside Eleanor Price and the chief financial officer. 2 empty seats separated them from Marcus Lane and his attorney. Marcus was no longer employed by Whitmore Urban Development, but his counsel had argued that he should be allowed to respond to allegations concerning the original project. He wore a gray suit and looked rested, as if dismissal had inconvenienced him rather than exposed him. Charles had not spoken to Annie since the planning meeting. When their eyes met across the room, he gave a small nod. Annie did not return it. A council member named Margaret Collins called the hearing to order. This session concerns the proposed redevelopment of Carter Heights and the request for final approval of acquisition, relocation, and demolition. Walter whispered, "Notice the order." Annie looked at him. Acquisition first, people second, buildings last. Councilwoman Collins continued. Whitmore Urban Development will present its proposal, followed by resident representatives and public comment. Marcus's attorney stood. Madam Chair, before the presentation begins, My client wishes to clarify that the original development strategy was approved through established corporate channels and complied with all applicable municipal requirements. Charles turned his head but said nothing. Collins replied, "Mr. Lane will have an opportunity to respond later." Marcus sat back. The first presentation came from a consulting firm hired months earlier. Large renderings appeared on the screen. Glass apartments, shops, office space, landscaped walkways, and people drinking coffee beneath trees that did not yet exist. The presenter spoke about economic renewal, increased tax revenue, construction jobs, and long-term property value. Carter Heights appeared only in the existing conditions section. Photographs showed broken rails, stained brick, damaged pavement, and an overflowing dumpster. None showed the community garden, children walking to school, the pantry cabinet, or residents repairing one another's cars. Annie leaned toward Walter. "They came on trash day." Walter nodded. "You can tell any story you want if you choose the right camera angle." The presenter concluded that full demolition would provide the clearest path toward neighborhood stabilization. Councilwoman Collins asked, "What happens to current residents?" The presenter looked toward the company table. The chief financial officer answered, "Eligible households receive relocation, compensation, moving assistance, and priority review at affiliated properties. How many current households can afford to return to the proposed development?" The financial officer paused. "The new project is primarily market rate." "So how many?" "We do not yet have a fixed number." A murmur passed through the residents. Marcus leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. The next speaker was an outside engineer. He described structural damage in buildings E and F and deferred maintenance throughout the complex. His conclusion was more measured than the company's original presentation. 4 buildings remain suitable for phased rehabilitation, he said. 2 require replacement. Councilman Robert Gaines frowned. "That is not what appeared in the packet submitted last month." "No, sir." "Why not?" The engineer looked toward Charles. Before Charles could answer, Marcus stood. "The rehabilitation concept was preliminary and failed to meet financial feasibility requirements." Councilwoman Collins struck the desk lightly with her gavel. "Mr. Lane, you are not recognized." Marcus sat, but his point had entered the room. The resident testimony began with Walter. He approached the microphone carrying only one sheet of paper. "My name is Walter Green. I have lived at Carter Heights for 29 years. I taught American history for 34. He adjusted the microphone. "We have been told the land beneath our homes has become more valuable than the people living on it. That is not how the sentence appears in the reports, but it is what the numbers mean." A council member asked whether he opposed all redevelopment. "No, we oppose being erased from it." Walter placed the resident survey on the clerk's table. "These households are connected to schools, jobs, churches, clinics, bus routes, and neighbors who provide care no company can replace with a moving allowance." Lillian spoke next. She explained her route to the hotel where she had worked for 11 years. "If I move to the property they offered, my commute becomes 2 buses and a train. The first bus does not run early enough for my shift." Raymond described his appointments at the VA and the neighbors who drove him when his leg pain made public transportation difficult. Then Denise approached the microphone. Annie watched her mother place both hands on the podium to steady her back. "My name is Denise Carter. I have lived in apartment C 214 for 17 years. I work in the kitchen at Grant Elementary School." Councilwoman Collins asked, "Miss Carter, what would relocation mean for your household?" Denise unfolded the company's offer. "This payment would cover a deposit and some moving costs if we found a landlord willing to rent to us." "And have you?" "I called 9 places. 3 had waiting lists. 4 required income I do not make. 1 was too far from my work without a car. The last one never returned my call." She looked toward Charles. "I am not asking anyone to preserve every cracked wall. I am asking why improvement must begin by removing the people who stayed while the walls were cracking." No one interrupted her. When Annie's name was called, she carried her binder to the front. The microphone sat too high. She lowered it, and someone in the back laughed softly. Annie waited until the sound stopped. "My name is Annie Carter. I'm 18 years old. Until last week, I was an intern at the airport." She removed the badge from her binder and placed it on the podium. "This says guest support intern." People saw it and decided how much I knew before I opened my mouth. Councilman Gaines asked, What does your airport employment have to do with this project? It is how I found Mr. Whitmore's file. The room shifted. Annie explained that Charles had left the file in the VIP lounge, that she had seen Carter Heights on the cover, and that she had found her mother's name on the first page. You opened confidential material? Marcus's attorney asked. I opened it to identify the owner. Did you photograph it? No. Can you prove that? Charles turned sharply toward the attorney. Annie answered before he could speak. No. Just as Mr. Whitmore could not prove I had done anything wrong when he ordered someone to search my phone. The room went silent. Councilwoman Collins looked at Charles. Is that accurate? Charles did not look toward Eleanor. Yes. Annie continued. I ran 3 streets to return that file. When I reached him, he asked whether I wanted money, tuition, or a job. Marcus watched her with a faint expression of satisfaction, as though each sentence damaged Charles more than it helped Carter Heights. Annie placed both hands on the podium. I did not run after Mr. Whitmore to beg. I ran because the file did not belong to me. She looked toward the council. I am here because our homes do belong to us in a way those reports do not measure. Maybe not the land, maybe not the brick, but the lives inside them do. Councilwoman Collins asked, what are you requesting? That you do not approve a plan until residents can see every option, including renovation, that no one loses assistance for waiting, that people who return after construction can still afford to live there. Marcus's attorney stood. Madam Chair, this is compelling testimony, but personal hardship cannot replace technical and financial analysis. Annie looked directly at him. Then why was the technical report supporting renovation removed? Marcus's face changed. Council members began speaking at once. Collins raised the gavel. Order. Charles remained seated, one hand resting on the dark blue file. Marcus leaned toward him. If you release that report, he whispered, you destroy the project. Charles looked at the Carter Heights residents filling the chamber, then at Annie's internship badge under the microphone. The council clerk announced that the presentation phase had ended. Before we proceed to preliminary consideration, Collins said, does Whitmore Urban Development wish to amend its submission? For several seconds, Charles did not move. Then he stood. The sound of his chair sliding back carried through the room. Yes, he said, we do. Charles stepped away from the company table and carried the dark blue file to the podium. Eleanor followed with 2 binders and a flash drive. Marcus remained seated, but the tension in his shoulders made him look ready to stand. Councilwoman Collins watched Charles approach. Mr. Whitmore, what amendment are you requesting? Charles placed the file on the podium. Whitmore Urban Development is withdrawing the demolition proposal in its current form. A murmur moved through the chamber. Marcus rose. Madam Chair, my former employer is making a decision without board authorization. Collins raised the gavel. Mr. Lane, sit down. Charles waited until the room settled. The submission presented to this council was incomplete, he said. A structural assessment showing that 4 of the 6 Carter Heights buildings could be rehabilitated was removed from the final packet. Councilman Gaines leaned forward. Removed by whom? Charles glanced at Marcus, then returned his attention to the council. The project director, Marcus Lane, authorized the final packet. Marcus's attorney stood. My client disputes the implication that information was concealed. The omitted material was preliminary and commercially inferior. Eleanor stepped beside Charles. The assessment was not preliminary, she said. It was completed by an independent engineering firm, signed, dated, and circulated to the development team 3 months ago. She handed copies to the clerk. The report concludes that buildings A through D are structurally suitable for phased renovation. Buildings E and F require replacement. It also includes a mixed income model that allows most current residents to remain or return. Collins opened the report. This was available before the demolition request was filed? Yes, Eleanor replied. And it was not submitted to this council? No. Marcus looked toward Charles. Because it did not meet the approved investment threshold. Charles turned to him. You told me the buildings could not be saved. I told you the rehabilitation model was not viable. You used the word impossible. Financially impossible. That word was missing when you spoke to me. Marcus gave a tight smile. Perhaps because we both understood what viable meant. The remark hung in the room. Charles looked down at the blue file. He could have used Marcus as a shield. He could have said a subordinate misled him, promised an internal review, and left the rest to lawyers. Instead, he faced the council. Mr. Lane removed the report, Charles said, but my name is on the proposal. Marcus's expression changed. Charles continued, I approved it without asking enough questions. I accepted a summary because it gave me the answer I expected. I rewarded speed, profit, and certainty. I created an organization where people learned that difficult facts were less welcome than profitable conclusions. No one spoke. Charles looked toward the Carter Heights residence. I did not visit the property before approving the plan. I did not read the individual relocation amounts. I did not ask whether those payments allowed families to remain near their jobs, schools, doctors, or public transportation. He paused. I saw units. I did not see households. Annie stood beside Denise, her hands folded over the binder. She listened without softening. Charles looked at her. When Miss Carter returned this file, my first response was not gratitude. I asked whether she had copied it. I ordered an employee to search her phone. A few residents murmured. I assumed her honesty had a price. I asked whether she wanted money, tuition, or a job. Charles's voice remained controlled, but the words came more slowly. She had run 3 city blocks in shoes that cut through her heel to return something that did not belong to her. I treated that act as a threat. He turned fully toward Annie. Miss Carter, I was wrong. Every camera in the chamber shifted toward her. Annie felt the attention pressing against her. She did not smile or rescue him from the silence. You were, she said. Charles nodded once. I am sorry. Annie held his gaze. Then fix what you can. I intend to. Marcus pushed back his chair. This is absurd. A $400 million project is being dismantled because a teenager delivered a moral lecture. Charles faced him. No. It is being corrected because you hid a viable plan. I protected the company. You protected your bonus. Marcus's attorney placed a hand on his arm, but Marcus ignored it. You approved every target. You demanded the highest return. You told us not to bring problems to your desk unless we had already solved them. I did. Then do not pretend I acted alone. I'm not. That answer stopped him. Charles continued. You made the decision to remove the report. I created the conditions that made you believe I would reward it. Both are true. Eleanor gave the clerk a second set of documents. These emails show that Mr. Lane instructed staff to exclude the rehabilitation option, accelerate relocation agreements, and classify certain residents according to their likelihood of challenging the company. Councilwoman Collins read the top page. What does low retention occupant mean? Eleanor answered. A household believed unlikely to contest relocation because of income, age, limited legal resources, or unstable lease status. The chamber erupted. Collins struck the gavel several times. Order, I will clear this room if necessary. Walter rose but did not shout. His voice carried anyway. They measured who was too poor to fight. Collins looked toward Eleanor. Is that a fair description? Eleanor did not evade it. Yes. Marcus's attorney stood again. The terminology is being taken out of context. Annie spoke from the resident section. What context makes that better? The attorney turned toward her. Miss Carter, this is a technical risk category. No. It is a list of people you thought would disappear quietly. Applause broke out from the back rows. Collins allowed it for several seconds before raising the gavel. Charles returned to the microphone. Effective immediately, Whitmore Urban Development is taking the following actions. The current demolition request is withdrawn. All relocation agreements are suspended. No resident will lose assistance by waiting for the review. The company will fund an independent audit of the Carter Heights project, including deferred maintenance, compensation calculations, and resident classification practices. Marcus stared at him. Charles continued. Mr. Lane has been terminated. Compensation connected to this project is frozen pending investigation. Any evidence of legal violations will be referred to the appropriate authorities. Councilman Gaines asked, what replaces the current plan? A new proposal developed with resident participation. Meaning what? 4 buildings will be evaluated for renovation, 2 for replacement. The plan will include affordable units, right to return protections, temporary housing within the area where possible, and written limits on rent increases. Marcus laughed under his breath. You have no investor approval for that. Charles looked at him. Then I will find investors willing to build it. And if you cannot, then we do not pretend displacement is the only form of progress. Councilwoman Collins reviewed the documents before her. This council will not consider final approval today. We are ordering an independent housing impact review and referring the submitted materials to the city attorney. The Carter Heights residents began to speak among themselves, but there was no celebration yet. They had heard too many promises written in careful language. Walter lifted a hand, and the room quieted around him. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "an apology is not a plan." Charles nodded. "I agree. Residents choose their own representatives." "Yes. They receive every report." "Yes. They have counsel not paid to protect your company." Charles glanced at Eleanor. "The company will fund independent counsel selected by the residents, with no control over that counsel's work." Walter looked toward Annie, Denise, Lillian, and Raymond. Only then did he sit. Collins announced that the city would schedule a new public session after the joint plan had been reviewed. As people rose, Charles carried the blue file from the podium to the residents' table. He placed it in front of Walter. Marcus watched from across the room. Charles said, "Copies of every non-privileged project document will be delivered by tomorrow." Annie rested one hand on the file. "This still belongs to you." "The original does," Charles said. "The decisions inside it no longer belong only to me." Annie studied him for a moment. "That's a start." Outside the chamber, reporters crowded the hallway. Charles's board members were already calling. Investors wanted explanations. Lawyers wanted control over his next sentence. Inside, Denise touched Annie's arm. "Do you think we won?" Annie looked at the blue file, the residents gathering around it, and Charles standing alone while his phone continued to vibrate in his pocket. "No," she said, "but they can't pretend we're not here anymore." The work began 3 days after the hearing, not with a groundbreaking ceremony, but with folding tables in the Carter Heights community room. Eleanor Price arrived carrying binders, printed schedules, and a box of nameplates. Behind her came 2 independent engineers, a city housing representative, a transit planner, and an attorney selected by the residents. Charles entered last and took a seat near the middle of the room. Walter noticed. "You usually sit at the head of the table?" he asked. "Yes. And today?" Charles looked around at the residents filling the chairs. "Today, I'm not the only person making the decision." Walter nodded. "Good place to start." The new planning committee included Denise, Lillian, Raymond, Curtis, 2 small business owners, and 3 residents elected from buildings A through F. Annie had been asked to represent young people in the complex. She had refused the first invitation. "I'm 18, she had told Walter. "People will think I'm there because of the file. You are there because you live here. They need someone with experience. They have experienced people. What they do not have is anyone asking what happens to the children and young workers 10 years from now." Annie eventually agreed, but only after Eleanor confirmed in writing that she would receive the same documents and voting rights as the adult representatives. The first meeting lasted 4 hours. The engineers explained that buildings A through D could be repaired in sections. The work would include new electrical systems, plumbing, roofs, windows, heating units, and reinforced stairs. Buildings E and F would be emptied, demolished, and rebuilt. Curtis raised his hand. "My family lives in E. Where do we go while they rebuild?" The city housing representative answered. "The current proposal uses vacant units after those units are repaired. How many families can those hold?" 27. There are more than 27 families in E and F. "Yes. So where do the rest go?" No one answered immediately. Curtis folded his arms. "Then the plan is not ready." Charles looked toward the project team. "He's right." The engineer nodded. "We'll need temporary units nearby." "Nearby means what?" Lillian asked. 5 miles? 20? The transit planner opened a map. They began marking schools, bus routes, hospitals, churches, grocery stores, and workplaces. What had once appeared as a single block of land became a web of daily dependence. By the second meeting, the company had identified 3 apartment properties within 4 miles. 2 required repairs. The third had enough vacant units, but charged higher rent. Denise read the proposal. "Who pays the difference?" "Whitmore Urban Development," Charles said. "For how long?" "Until residents return. And if construction runs late?" "The company continues paying." The resident's attorney looked at him. "Put that in the agreement." Charles turned to Eleanor. "Write it in." The meetings continued twice a week. They were rarely calm. Some residents wanted every building preserved. Others preferred new construction. Several feared that market-rate apartments would bring higher stores, higher taxes, and pressure on long-time tenants. Small business owners wanted guarantees that they could return without paying 3 times their current rent. A grocery store owner named Mr. Alvarez placed his lease on the table. "My family has been here 14 years. If you rebuild the commercial space and call it premium retail, I'm gone." Charles asked, "What would allow you to return?" "Rent protection, 5 years minimum." The finance team objected. Charles asked them to calculate it anyway. At another meeting, Raymond pointed to the proposed parking garage. "You have more spaces for cars than benches for old people." The architect looked confused. Raymond continued, "Some of us do not drive. We still need somewhere to sit while waiting for the bus." The next design included covered seating near the street. Annie watched the plan change one question at a time. No single request seemed large enough to alter a $400 million project. Together, they changed its purpose. The final proposal took 6 weeks to complete. 4 buildings would be renovated in phases. 2 would be rebuilt with elevators and accessible units. Current residents would receive a written right to return. Rent increases would be limited under a long-term affordability agreement. Market-rate apartments on the east parcel would help finance the project. No child would be required to change schools because of temporary relocation. Elderly and disabled residents would receive moving assistance coordinated through the community office. The laundromat, grocery store, and barber shop would receive protected leases. The name Carter Heights would remain. At the final committee meeting, Charles presented an additional proposal. The company will fund a workforce center on the ground floor of the new Building E. A slide appeared listing training in electrical work, HVAC, welding, construction management, and building technology. Residents between 17 and 24 will receive paid training, he said. Graduates will receive priority consideration for jobs connected to the renovation. Annie studied the slide. Who chooses the trainees? A committee. Whose committee? Charles glanced at Eleanor. The company's original draft gave us final approval. Annie closed her folder. Then it is still charity controlled by the people giving it. What do you suggest? Open applications, published requirements, resident representatives on the selection panel, written reasons when someone is rejected. The workforce director said, "That will slow the process." Annie looked at him. "Fair processes usually take longer than private decisions." Charles nodded. "Change it." After the meeting, he asked Annie to remain. Walter waited near the door, but Annie told him she would be fine. Charles handed her a thin envelope. "What is this?" "A scholarship offer, tuition, books, and transportation for community college." Annie did not open it. "For me?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because you have the ability, and because your internship ended after you returned my file." "That sounds like compensation." "It is intended as support. Support for me, or relief for you." Charles looked at the envelope in her hand. "I thought it might help." "It would." Annie placed it on the table. "That's why I can't take it." He frowned. "You would rather struggle?" "I would rather know I earned the place I'm standing." "You earned more than this. Then build something that does not depend on knowing you." Charles sat back. Annie continued, "Use the money for a scholarship fund open to every young person here. Same application, same rules, no private phone calls. You would be eligible. If I qualify." He watched her for a moment. "You never make it easy to help you. You still think help means choosing the answer for someone else." Charles looked toward the envelope. Then he nodded. "All right, open fund, independent selection, and paid internships. Yes, not stipends that disappear when someone misses one shift." Charles almost smiled. "You negotiate like someone twice your age. I've been reading contracts written by people twice mine." The revised plan went before the city council the following month. This time, the presentation began with a map showing current households, schools, transit routes, and local businesses. Residents spoke alongside engineers. The financial report showed lower early returns but stable long-term revenue. The council approved the project by a wide margin. No one at Carter Heights celebrated until the resident attorney confirmed every protection had been placed in writing. That evening, folding tables filled the courtyard. Denise brought macaroni and cheese from the school kitchen. Mrs. Dalton brought peach cobbler. Curtis grilled chicken while children ran between the buildings. Charles attended without cameras. Walter handed him a paper plate. "You know, this does not make you the hero." Charles accepted the plate. I know. It makes you responsible for keeping the promises. I know that too. Across the courtyard, Annie helped tape a new notice to the community board. It did not announce a deadline or warn residents to prepare to leave. It listed dates for renovation meetings, temporary housing applications, job training enrollment, and elections for the Permanent Resident Council. For years, Carter Heights had received decisions in envelopes. Now its residents were helping write them. By early spring, the first phase of construction had begun at Carter Heights. Metal fencing surrounded Building A, and scaffolding covered its western wall. Workers arrived before sunrise in reflective vests, carrying toolboxes and coffee in paper cups. The old courtyard now held temporary signs directing residents around closed walkways. But the community board remained near the entrance, protected beneath a new plastic cover. Annie stopped there each morning before catching the bus. One notice listed community college enrollment dates. Another announced applications for the Carter Heights Workforce Program. A third showed the renovation schedule in plain language, including which floors would move first, where residents would stay, and whom to call if transportation or medical care was affected. The notices were not perfect. Residents still complained that some print was too small, and that the hotline kept people waiting too long. But the information no longer arrived as a final decision. People could question it before it became permanent. Inside apartment C-214, Denise sealed the last cardboard box. She wrote kitchen across the top, then paused. Annie stood beside her holding the marker. You forgot something. Denise looked at her. Annie turned the box slightly and wrote beneath the label, coming back home. Denise read the words, then pressed her lips together. You know they said 6 months. I know. Construction schedules lie. Then we'll make them put every delay in writing. Denise shook her head. You spend too much time with Mr. Green. He says the same thing about you. The temporary apartment was 3 miles away. Close enough for Denise to keep her job, and for Annie to remain on the same bus route. Whitmore Urban Development paid the difference in rent, the moving costs, and storage. The agreement also guaranteed their return to C-214 after renovation. Denise had read the contract twice. Annie had read it 4 times. On moving day, Walter stood in the hallway directing volunteers as though he had been appointed general of a very small army. Photographs in your own car, he said. Important papers stay with you. Do not put medicine on the truck. Raymond carried a lamp downstairs. Lillian wrapped Denise's dishes in old newspapers. Curtis, whose daughter had been born 3 weeks earlier, arrived with a borrowed pickup and refused to leave until the last box was loaded. Charles came without reporters. He wore jeans, work boots, and a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up. The clothes were expensive enough that no one mistook him for a worker. But he carried boxes without asking which ones looked light. When he reached the box marked kitchen coming back home, Denise stopped him. That one stays upright. Charles adjusted his grip. Anything breakable? Everything in it has survived 17 years. I'd like to keep the record going. He nodded and carried it down carefully. Annie watched from the landing. You don't have to help, she said when he returned. I know. Then why are you here? Charles looked toward the open apartment door. The walls were bare now, exposing lighter rectangles where photographs had hung. Because signing the relocation agreement was not the same as seeing relocation happen. That almost sounds like something Walter would say. I'm learning to recognize the difference between paperwork and consequence. Annie handed him a smaller box. Start with consequences marked bathroom. At the temporary apartment, Denise placed the kitchen box near the stove but did not unpack it completely. She removed only what they needed. Why leave the rest? Annie asked. Because this is not home. The answer was simple, without bitterness. Annie understood. 2 weeks later, she received an email from South Atlanta Community College. She had been accepted into the Urban Planning and Community Services program. Her financial aid package included a grant from the Carter Heights Education Fund, which had received applications from 37 young residents. Annie's award covered tuition, books, and a transit pass. The selection letter did not mention Charles. It listed her grades, community work, essay score, and financial need. Denise read the email over Annie's shoulder. You got it. I got it. Her mother hugged her hard enough to make the laptop tilt. Walter arrived that evening carrying sparkling cider in a paper bag. Lillian brought fried chicken, and Mrs. Dalton appeared with peach cobbler before anyone had invited her. Charles sent no private gift. Instead, the fund published the names of 12 recipients, the selection criteria, and the members of the independent review panel. Annie saved a copy. The following month, a full-time customer support position opened at the airport. Annie stared at the listing for 2 days before applying. Denise noticed the application open on the laptop. "You want to go back?" "I want the job." "That is not what I asked." Annie closed the screen halfway. "I don't want the place that fired me to decide. I'm afraid of it." The interview panel included Pamela, a new human resources director, and 2 managers Annie had never met. They asked about her experience, conflict resolution, and the day she left her station. Annie answered without defending every choice. "I should have notified a supervisor before leaving," she said. "The airport should also have had a clear process for returning sensitive property when the owner was still nearby." Pamela asked, "Would you make the same decision again?" "I would still protect the property. I would do it through a better process." "And if the process failed?" Annie thought for a moment. "Then I would document who I notified and why I acted." Doing the right thing does not excuse poor procedure, but procedure should not become an excuse to do nothing. The room remained quiet. 2 days later, the airport offered her the position. It came with regular wages, health coverage, paid training, and a written probation period. Annie accepted. On her first morning back, Pamela met her near the employee entrance and handed her a new badge. Guest Support Associate. Pamela glanced at the old internship badge in Annie's hand. "You kept it?" "For a while." "Why?" Annie clipped the new badge to her blouse. "Because a title can tell people where I stand. It shouldn't decide what I'm worth." Pamela nodded. "I owe you an apology." "You do. I should have looked at the full situation before supporting the termination." Annie waited. Pamela continued. "I was worried about the airport's reputation, and I became easier to remove than the problem." Yes, the answer mattered because it did not come with an excuse. Annie placed the old badge in her bag. "I'm not asking you to forget it," Pamela said. "I won't." At Whitmore Urban Development, Charles faced a different review. The board had concluded that he failed to maintain adequate oversight of the Carter Heights project. He remained chairman, but an independent compliance committee gained authority over major acquisitions and relocation plans. 3 investors withdrew. The company's projected earnings fell. Marcus Lane filed a wrongful termination claim, then withdrew it after additional emails were disclosed. The independent investigation found that he had manipulated reports, pressured contractors, and delayed repairs to strengthen the demolition case. His project bonuses were revoked, and the findings were sent to city authorities for review. Charles did not announce victory. At the next board meeting, he presented new company rules. Every redevelopment proposal would include a relocation impact assessment, a rehabilitation alternative, resident testimony, and all minority engineering opinions. Management bonuses would consider resident retention, affordability, and completion of community commitments, not profit alone. One director objected, "You are turning social policy into corporate policy." Charles answered, "We were already making social policy. We simply refused to admit it when other people paid the cost." 6 months after moving out, Denise and Annie returned to C-214. The apartment had new windows, plumbing, heating, cabinets, and reinforced stairs outside. The rooms were still small. The view still faced the courtyard. Denise entered first. The old radiator no longer knocked. She stood in the silence and laughed softly. "I thought I hated that sound." "You did." "I know." Annie carried in the kitchen box. Together, they cut through the tape beneath the words "coming back home." They placed the dishes in the new cabinets and returned the family photographs to the wall. Outside, workers continued on the next building. Children crossed the courtyard under temporary fencing. Walter argued with a contractor about the height of a handrail. Carter Heights was not finished. Neither was Annie, but the doors that once seemed too small had begun to open, and this time, she entered them without lowering her head. 1 year after Annie returned to apartment C-214, the last construction fence came down at Carter Heights. The 6 buildings no longer looked identical. Buildings E and F had been rebuilt with elevators, wider hallways, and ground-floor apartments for residents with limited mobility. Buildings A through D kept their old brick exteriors, but the windows, roofs, wiring, and plumbing had been replaced. The courtyard had new lights, covered benches, and a playground positioned where parents could watch from their windows. Near the entrance stood the original Carter Heights sign. The paint had been restored, but the metal frame still carried dents from years of weather and children climbing on it. Walter had refused every proposal to replace it. A new sign would be cleaner, the architect had told him. So would a new history, Walter replied. We are keeping both. The reopening ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday morning. Folding chairs filled the courtyard, and a small platform stood near the community garden. City officials, residents, construction workers, reporters, and members of the Whitmore board gathered beneath a clear Atlanta sky. Denise arrived early, carrying trays of biscuits from the school kitchen. Her back still hurt, but she now worked fewer double shifts because Annie's full-time airport wages helped with rent and groceries. Annie came directly from an early shift, wearing her Navy uniform and new employee badge. She had finished her first semester at community college with high marks and had begun taking evening courses in housing policy and urban planning. Pamela had approved her schedule without asking her to choose between work and school. Walter stood near the front row with a cane he disliked using. You're late, he told Annie. The ceremony starts in 20 minutes. That is late when people expect you to fix the microphone. Why would I know how to fix a microphone? You are young. People assume that means electronics. Annie checked the cable and found that it had not been plugged in. Walter smiled. Assumption confirmed. Curtis and Keisha arrived with their daughter, Maya, who had learned to walk in their temporary apartment and taken her first steps at Carter Heights after they returned. Lillian came straight from the hotel, still wearing her work shoes. Raymond sat near the new bus shelter, testing the bench as though it had been designed for his inspection. Mr. Alvarez had reopened his grocery store in the ground floor of Building E. The new lease protected his rent for 5 years. His daughter managed the register while he handed out bottled water to anyone who walked past. At 10, Charles stepped onto the platform. He wore a dark suit but no tie. Behind him stood a covered bronze plaque. Eleanor sat in the front row beside the resident attorney and 2 independent engineers. Charles looked at the crowd. A year ago, Whitmore Urban Development came to Carter Heights with a plan already written, he began. We believed our responsibility was to explain it well enough that residents would accept it. Walter leaned toward Annie. At least he learned to say we. Charles continued. The plan was efficient on paper. It was also incomplete, dishonest in important ways, and built on the assumption that those most affected had the least authority to object. Several board members shifted in their chairs. Charles did not soften the statement. We withdrew that plan because residents demanded the truth. Engineers defended their work. Legal counsel refused to hide what had been found, and one young woman returned a file when keeping it might have given her more power. Annie looked down. Charles turned toward her. Annie Carter did not save Carter Heights alone. She has reminded me of that more than once. A few people laughed, but she did something that made everything else possible. She acted with integrity, when she had no reason to believe anyone would reward it. He paused. The first time I met her, I asked what she wanted in exchange. I was looking for a price because I had forgotten that some actions are not transactions. Annie felt Denise take her hand. Charles gestured toward the rebuilt complex. This project cost more and took longer than our original proposal. Early returns are lower. Several investors left. None of those facts changed what we owed the people who lived here. He looked toward the Whitmore employees gathered near the platform. We now require every redevelopment plan to include resident participation, relocation impact studies, rehabilitation alternatives, and independent review. Those policies do not guarantee that every decision will be right. They make it harder to hide a wrong one. Charles stepped away from the microphone and invited Walter to join him. Walter climbed the platform slowly. Charles reached out to help, but Walter waved him off and took the final step himself. Together they removed the cloth covering the plaque. It read, Carter Heights, Community Courtyard, rebuilt with the residents who called it home. Below those words were the names of the elected resident council, engineers, local businesses, and workforce trainees who had worked on the project. Annie searched the plaque. Her name was listed among the resident representatives, the same size as everyone else's. Walter noticed. Disappointed? No. Good. Monuments are dangerous when they make one person look responsible for what many people carried. Charles returned to the microphone. The workforce program has graduated 42 residents. 31 are now employed in construction, maintenance, electrical work, or building operations. The Education Fund has awarded 26 grants. Applause rose from the chairs. Annie clapped with everyone else. Her grant had been renewed for a second year, but only after she submitted her grades, financial records, and volunteer hours like every other applicant. The rejection and appeal procedures were printed on the program website. She had checked. After the speeches, reporters surrounded Charles near the platform. A local television journalist approached Annie with a microphone. "Do you believe Mr. Whitmore deserves credit for what happened here?" Annie glanced toward Charles. He was answering questions beside Eleanor while two board members waited behind him. "He deserves credit for changing the plan," she said. "He also deserves responsibility for approving the first one." The journalist raised her eyebrows. "You don't think his apology settled that? An apology can start a repair. It cannot replace one. What do you think saved Carter Heights?" Annie looked across the courtyard. Curtis was lifting Maya onto the new playground steps. Lillian was explaining the bus schedule to a city planner. Raymond was telling a construction supervisor that one bench still leaned slightly. Denise was arranging biscuits beside Mrs. Dalton's peach cobbler. Walter stood beneath the old sign, arguing with a reporter who had called the complex formerly blighted. "People kept records," Annie said. "They showed up. They asked questions after being told the decision was finished. Some were brave, some were afraid, most were both." The journalist lowered the microphone. "And the file?" The file opened a door. "Was returning it worth losing your internship?" Annie touched the badge clipped to her blouse. "I lost a position. I did not lose the truth about what I did." Later that afternoon, when the officials and cameras had gone, the residents remained in the courtyard. Music played from a speaker near the garden. Children drew with chalk on the new pavement. The smell of grilled chicken and corn drifted between the buildings. Charles stood alone near the restored sign. Annie approached carrying 2 cups of lemonade and handed him one. "You stayed after the reporters left," she said. "I was told the food improves once the speeches end." "That sounds like Walter. He gave me the advice." They watched Denise laugh with Lillian near the serving table. Charles took a drink. "How was college?" "Hard." "And the airport?" "Also hard." "You sound pleased." "I am." He nodded toward the plaque. "You could still transfer to a 4-year school later. The fund would consider it. If I qualify." "If you qualify." Annie smiled slightly. Charles looked at the buildings. "I used to think responsibility meant making the final decision. What do you think now?" "That it means remaining after the decision, especially when the consequences become inconvenient." Annie considered that. "Walter might let you teach one of his lessons." "I doubt it. He makes everyone repeat the class." Across the courtyard, Walter raised his cane. "Annie, Mr. Whitmore, stop discussing philosophy and carry these chairs." Charles removed his jacket. Annie picked up 2 chairs and handed him 3. "You're younger than Walter," she said. "He expects more from you." They carried the chairs into the community room. Near the door, the dark blue file rested inside a glass display case beside the first relocation notice, the corrected letter, the resident survey, and the final right to return agreement. A small card beneath them read, "These documents changed only after people refused to remain numbers on a page." Annie stopped for a moment. A year earlier, she had run through traffic because the file did not belong to her. She had believed returning it would end her responsibility. Instead, it had revealed how much responsibility belonged to everyone else. She closed the display case and followed Charles back into the courtyard. The sun was lowering behind the buildings, reflecting in new windows that looked out over the same old community. Carter Heights had not been saved by wealth, anger, or one act of courage. It had been rebuilt because truth was returned to the people who had been excluded from it, and because once they were heard, they refused to disappear quietly. The story teaches us that integrity still matters, even when doing the right thing comes at a personal cost. Annie's courage did not change Carter Heights by itself, but it forced powerful people to face the truth they had ignored. Real justice begins when ordinary people speak up, keep records, stand together, and refuse to be treated as numbers. It also reminds us that an apology has value only when it is followed by responsibility, transparency, and meaningful action. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.